New York City has a housing problem so big that it changes how people live their entire lives. And when a city is under that much pressure, the solution starts sounding extreme. So when a politician says that he's going to freeze rent, it sounds like the cleanest solution imaginable. And that is exactly what Zoran Mamdani is proposing for New York City. It sounds simple, but housing is not a simple system. It is not a straight road where you point in one direction and arrive. It is more like a dance floor that never stops moving. So in this video, we're going to dive deep into the implications of this policy. First, we need to define what we're even talking about. A rent freeze does not mean every rent in New York City stops going up. It targets rent-stabilized units. These are apartments where rent increases are regulated under a system that already exists. And in New York City, that's a huge chunk of the city. Roughly 1 million apartments fall under rent stabilization, housing more than 2 million people. That is about a quarter of the city. You are basically grabbing one massive lever in the housing market and pulling it hard. Now, a rent freeze is not a permanent fix. It is a pause button, and pause buttons can be lifesavers, or they can create problems you only notice later. Let's start with why supporters love this idea. Because on paper, the benefit is immediate. If your rent is already barely affordable, a freeze means your renewal does not come with a punch to the face. It means you can plan again. It means you do not have to move just because the calendar flipped. And that matters more than people think, because stability is a form of wealth. When tenants are not constantly being pushed out, neighborhoods hold together. Supporters also point out something important. And this isn't a brand new concept in New York. There is precedent for rent freezes within the existing framework. In 2015 and 2016, the city's rent guideline system froze rents on one-year leases. Landlords hated it, but the city didn't actually collapse. So to supporters, the rent freeze is basically a pressure release valve. It's exactly the kind of breathing room a New Yorker needs, but now we have to talk about the part that makes this complicated. A rent freeze is not freezing time. Costs do not freeze just because rent does. Buildings still need repairs, boilers still break, roofs still leak, elevators still fail, property taxes still exist, insurance still goes up, labor still costs more, materials still cost more. So the moment you freeze rent increases, a mismatch gets created. On one side, revenue that stays flat. On the other side, costs that keep moving. That mismatch is the core argument against the policy. Critics say, okay, you froze rent, great, but where does the money come from to maintain the building? And this is not an abstract worry. New York already has a famous warning sign: public housing. Crumbling infrastructure, broken systems, and repair backlogs measured in billions. Opponents argue a broad rent freeze in the private stabilized market could create the same pattern: less maintenance, more deferred repairs, and buildings slowly degrading. So at this point, you might think, okay, so the rent freeze helps tenants, but hurts landlords. But that's too simple, because landlords is not one type of person. Some landlords are huge companies with deep pockets. Others are small owners with one building or a few units, and their financial reality is completely different. A rent freeze hits them differently, and the policy does not care which type you are. The freeze is the freeze. That's where the fight starts. Supporters say a quarter of the city needs relief, and landlords have had years of rising rents. Critics say if you squeeze the wrong owners, you get building neglect or you push them to sell. And if they sell, who buys? Often, the buyers with the most capital, the most patience, the best ability to navigate the system. So one weird possible second-order effect is consolidation. A rent freeze, depending on the details, can unintentionally push smaller landlords out and pull bigger players in. Again, not guaranteed. But this is what people mean when they say housing is a dance floor. You change one move, the whole room responds. Now let's talk about the biggest misunderstanding people have about rent freezes. They think freezing rent creates affordability. It creates affordability for current tenants in stabilized units. That's huge. But it does not automatically create more housing. It does not automatically create more available apartments. And it does not automatically help the next person trying to move into the city. In fact, depending on how the rest of the market responds, it could make access harder. Here's why. When people get a stable, protected rent, they stay, even if they might have moved otherwise. That's rational. If you have something scarce, you hold it. So turnover can drop, fewer stabilized units hit the market, and the people who are not already in stabilized housing end up competing harder for what remains. That can push pressure into the non-stabilized market, where prices can move faster. This is the most uncomfortable truth about rent-stabilized systems in general. They protect the insiders. They do not automatically solve the outsider problem. So if you freeze rents and do nothing else, you may protect millions while making the market tighter for everyone trying to break in. That does not make the freeze evil. It just means it is incomplete on its own. Now we have to talk about the legal and political reality. Even if a rent freeze is popular, landlords do not just accept it quietly. If you freeze increases across a massive segment of the market, you should expect lawsuits. You should expect organized opposition. You should expect political pressure. This matters because a rent freeze is not just economics. It's enforcement. A rule is only real if it survives challenge and gets implemented cleanly. So one of the questions is not, is a rent freeze a good idea? It's, can it be executed without collapsing into court fights and delays? Because if it gets stuck, you don't get a clean pause. You get uncertainty. And uncertainty is its own kind of damage in housing. Tenants do not know what's coming. Owners do not know what's allowed. Everything slows down. So now we're at the real question. What is a rent freeze actually for? If you treat it like a final solution, it will fail. Because it does not fix supply, it does not fix construction bottlenecks, and it does not freeze costs. But if you treat it like a bridge, it starts to make more sense. A rent freeze can buy time. It can reduce displacement. It can stabilize millions of lives in one move. But buying time only matters if you use that time. If you do not, the pressure comes back later, sometimes worse. So the real debate is not just freeze or no freeze. It's what else happens while the freeze is in effect. Because if you freeze rent in a city that is already short on housing and you do not expand supply, you are basically putting a lid on a pot that is still heating up. The lid helps for a while, but the heat is still there. So here's the bottom line. Supporters see a city where millions finally get breathing room. Critics see a policy that could squeeze maintenance, tighten availability, and trigger backlash. Both are reacting to real mechanics. Housing policy is not about intentions. It's about consequences. And the reason this matters is simple. If New York City can pull off a rent freeze without triggering decay, without triggering chaos, and without making the market even more inaccessible, it becomes a model, not just a headline. A rent freeze at this scale is not a small story. It is one of the biggest housing experiments in America. And if this policy does go through, we are about to watch what happens when you hit pause on a quarter of a city.